planning on. So today we're going to be talking about see, segment, and secure. The idea is understanding your environment. So I'm going to bring up some screens. I'm going to introduce Eric Berkman. He's from Order. They're an IoT organization. But from what I've learned over the last little bit, it's much more than just IoT. It's much more than being able to understand what IoT is. But as you sit in your environment and you're looking as a sensor, paying attention to everything that's going on, you get to recognize a lot of things that are happening. A couple examples before we get started is we're just in the middle of a proof of concept for a customer that within 30 minutes of activating the sensor, they saw nearly 5,000 different devices. Of those 5,000 devices, it recognized about 50 of them being Windows 98 devices. So the customer immediately got scared and said, we don't have any Windows 98 devices. And that was last Friday. Then we had a call with them on Monday. And what the system realized is it first recognized the systems as Windows 98 and flagged them as a security concern. But by the time the weekend came through, the system had done enough artificial intelligence on the systems that were there and realized they weren't Windows 98 boxes, but they were Windows CE boxes, which still has some security issues, but not as many as they would have originally had. So that was kind of neat. The other neat and intriguing thing that we're going to talk about, and now I'm going to pull up the presentation for Eric to go through, is they have a ton of different VLANs. And what was really neat about how the system was working is as it was going through, it was recognizing which devices on which VLANs were talking to which other devices. And the end user was able to click on a VLAN and it would automatically show all the other communications. He's like, wait a minute, VLAN A is not supposed to be talking to VLAN B, and he instantly had gratification for the system was there. So what we're going to talk about is you can't segment and you can't secure until you know what's happening. So that's why we're going to talk about see, segment, and secure. So Eric, I'm going to start out with a question and I'm going to bring up your presentation. But, what is important about seeing everything, and, from the perspective of security risk?
Yeah, Craig, I thank you and good morning, everybody. I appreciate the time. Craig, I think actually what I would say is not only do we want to quote unquote see everything, we want to see everything with high fidelity and high information. And if we look at the rate of which, in particular, unmanaged devices, Craig, are being added to the network, whether it be, medical workstations or IoT devices, cameras, and all of that element, frankly, the current network is only really providing like an OUI ID number. And you need to really have a much more finer detail of information, granular information, because there's a lot of data out there regarding device information around vulnerabilities and CVE and FDA recalls. And we're seeing that right now, Craig, with unfortunately with the significant CISA alert that took place yesterday regarding healthcare ransomware. And you need to have high precision of information. And then if we look at specifically for unmanaged devices, since you can't put an agent, you can't patch that device, you really are working towards creating micro-segmentation elements around IoT to mitigate risk. And if you don't have deep precision, Craig, around what that is, it's frankly very difficult to build micro-segmentation tunnels in an environment if you don't know what it is. So that's that's really how I'd answer that question. And then the other thing I would say is that everyone is forecasting the endpoint ratio to change in the next 24 to 48 months, where all of a sudden 65% of the endpoints in an environment, Craig, frankly, will be defined as unmanaged or IoT. And that's a pretty interesting thing that we all need to be, as security practitioners, need to be aware of. Does that help?
Yeah, you asked you made one statement of, you said that there's certain devices that can't be upgraded. Can you sort of dive into that, not just from the medical space, but even maybe from the power space, or for even from the just physical security like cameras or anything? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, no, that's great. Great question. So you're right. With medical, in many cases, it's very everyone understands it. Where we're using an embedded OS, it's gone through an FDA approval process, Greg, right? And that's a relatively time-consuming process. And so manufacturers are loath to constantly change that once they get FDA approval. In non-medical environments, we've got camera devices, HVAC devices that are out there that frankly don't have the BIOS capacity, et cetera, to load a security agent. They just frankly don't have enough horsepower to do so because they have a very finite amount of detail of what they're going to do. And so in many cases, you have environments that are going to topple over if you try to load something on there, even if they have the ability, frankly, to load anything on the environment. So that's what I would say from an unmanaged device perspective is that in many cases, the devices just frankly can't handle the footprint or the marker, if you will, of an agent to be loaded on device.
Okay. Okay. Do you want to drive through some of the presentation?
Yeah, this is actually really interesting. This isn't necessarily about technology. This is about driving the conversation of IoT. And one of the things, the analogy that I use all the time, Craig, is it's an iceberg, meaning that all of the mass of the iceberg is below the water. So how do we, really understand what's beneath the water? And you'd be amazed at what we see. And so this is a pretty particular. We did a recent study called Rise of the Machines, and we have over 5 million devices now of customers, and it allows us to get some incredible data samples to share with the outside world. And more often than not, when I speak to organizations about IoT or OT devices, I'm told that we have a policy that we have some dedicated VLANs. And Craig, to your point, as soon as we start to do proof of concepts and show, what might be the policy is not happening in the wild. And you'd be amazed at how many times that mixed VLAN, you can see here from the data that we've seen of our exact customers, when you're talking 75% of the deployments have this mixed nature, this is taking we actually take the policy and make sure it's being driven execution. So I think this is something first and foremost about visibility, Craig, that's so important. I kind of joke around, my son has a closet for his shoes, but I trip over shoes all over the house. And to me, that's the same kind of thing with some of the things we think there. And frankly, we all know as security practitioners, educating the user is our biggest challenge. And you'd be amazed now with Alexa and Amazons and Pelotons that are being plugged into corporate networks, whether it be the guest Wi-Fi, et cetera, because they haven't thought about it. Who's monitoring that process? So this is what we see all the time. And then, Craig, to your point, the next slide speaks to this idea of taking CVE or serial information and understanding. So if there's devices, for example, with FDA recalls or Ripple 20, right? Ripple 20 has not been weaponized, thank goodness yet, that we know of, but we are working with the manufacturers of power companies, et cetera. And because we get down to seeing the serial number of these devices, we've already spoken to customers and said, by the way, we were in here to talk about this, but we found 3 or 4 power supplies working with that particular manufacturer that is vulnerable to a Ripple 20 if it were to become weaponized. So I think having this type of information is really, really important. And then as you pointed out, Craig, this idea of outdated OSs, and the next slide kind of speaks to that. Microsoft, for example, has been aggressively, really turning down their OS support. And we've seen that time and time again. And we constantly find like Windows 7s, and to your point, Craig, we see that this is an embedded device. It makes sense to us. But why do we have 5 printers in the year 2020 still running Windows 7? Let's go and, we can upgrade that printer, for example. And this alone really customers respond to and want to talk about. And you know, these are kind of the things that we believe a deeper visibility makes sense, and would love to, you know, we did unmute everybody. So if the people on the call would love to kind of share their insights or questions, I think this might be a good spot to do so.
Yeah, so I'd like to actually ask the attendees is, you know, if you've seen on some of the slides, we talk about medical, but the reference I was using earlier had to do with a large manufacturing organization. May I ask what industries are the attendees from? Because we'd love to tailor some of our conversation to help you directly versus talking generically.
Absolutely, great question.
Mike?
Mike, you're yeah, Mike's got his hand up. I appreciate it. Mike, go ahead.
Hi. So, yeah, so I run a cybersecurity consulting business located here in Eastern North Carolina. It's just so interesting to me that we faced the same situation in a job that I was in many years ago, you know, around early 2000s. And then Windows NT was the boogeyman. And I remember asking the business units, do you guys have any Windows NT still running? Oh, no, we don't. Well, I did a scan of the network and found close to 100 different instances of Windows NT. What they'd done, they repurposed Windows NT servers to become print servers. And
yeah.
Nobody thought anything of it, you know. So that was a nice cleanup activity that I got involved in. But leaving that and coming to today, one of the challenges that we face, particularly in my field, as somebody who runs vulnerability assessments and pen tests, the companies kind of they want to put the IoT stuff out of scope because they think they've got it segmented. They probably don't, though. But we can't touch the IoT or the ICS stuff because they're afraid that some critical functions are going to go crashing down. So if we in security can't see what's really on the network, how are we going to make recommendations to protect it and to improve the health of the network?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So Mike, that's a great point in a use case that we see all the time. You know, once we see everything, we can now actually work with traditional vulnerability management tools like a Tenable or a Rapid7, and we can start to articulate this VLAN has some critical infrastructure. Because remember, a Philips, something can come back and say, oh, this is a Mac OU for Philips. Well, is that a patient monitor or is it a light switch? And it just says Philips based on the Mac information. Well, now all of a sudden we can come back and communicate because as Craig has been talking about, we want to see everything. We can say, you know what, vulnerability management tool, this VLAN, they're all Philips light monitors. So go ahead and make a vulnerability scan. And we actually have seen clients where, frankly, they had stopped scanning certain segments of the network for in excess of 12 to 18 months. And now, because of this, their security efficacy and footprint is really increased. So I think you're right on. It needs to be an IoT visibility that communicates to other tools and sets of security and network infrastructure. You can't have it stand on its own. It has to be integrated into other tools for scale and everything else. And so I appreciate that. You know, Alex, you've been on since the beginning. Do you want to share kind of the industry that you're in? I want to make sure that Craig and I are talking about that appropriately, and then I'll probably ask the same of Gerald as well.
So Alex,
I don't know if you hear. I'm sorry, what?
It looks like Alex isn't interested to ask that.
No worries. We're not pressuring anybody here. How about you, Gerald? Okay. All right.
There we go. Okay. Sorry about that.
Oh, there we go. Okay. No, please. Thank you.
And just so I'm clear, what was the, first of all, good morning. What was the question you asked there?
Yeah, Craig, go ahead.
So Gerald, the question is, through through this presentation so far, you've seen us talk about healthcare, because healthcare seems to be like an area that has a lot of devices that aren't upgradable.
Right.
And we were just asking the attendees of what industry do you all work in, so we can help tailor this conversation. We were hoping to have everybody open instead of having a presentation and everybody falling asleep, have an active conversation that would be beneficial for you.
Oh,
So,
awesome. Sure.
what
So I'm
industry do you
currently
work
working in financial today, but one thing I would ask would be if you could talk about like manufacturing. I
Yep.
in prior years, I was doing some consulting work, and we were working with the manufacturer in Canada. And I'm just curious as to your perspective on that and how they deal with that, because oftentimes, to your point earlier about them thinking they segmented networks, and often they're not. So any guidance or around that would be great. All right.
Super. No, thanks. Thanks so much, Gerald. In
Oh, sure
fact, this
thing.
is very timely because we're seeing outside of healthcare, one of the, as Craig had mentioned, we're doing an active POC together with the Teneo group in manufacturing. There is an absolute movement taking place in manufacturing with digital transformation in terms of, made to order, for example, consumer visibility into the manufacturing floor or their order. And the only way that they're going to relate to that is coming into the traditional IP network. And what we've seen is historically OT devices with simple, basic industrial ICS information was in an air gap network, truly isolated from the rest of the environment. And, what they were concerned about was, what are my latest ICS configs? Am I consistent with those ICS configs? And if there is a particular configuration that's out of whack on a particular OT area, can you please let me know? And so it was very OT confined, Gerald. What we've seen now is the network is completely flattened out. The cost of running and maintaining a separate and distinct air gap network are prohibitive. And so now all of a sudden, OT devices are flooding the traditional IP network, and now the network administrator is being asked to be responsible for them, as well as the CISO's office. And this isn't about OT and a day in the life of an OT device. This is now about how an OT device is, who are you, what is your temperature, and where are you allowed to communicate across the network. And we have seen manufacturing organizations now have a flood of OT devices hit the network, and there's no consistent understanding of how, perfect, that's great, how they're literally communicating across the network. And so this visibility not only is about the device itself, but what protocols and to where it's communicating, which servers, which workstations, and which external elements, Gerald. And we're seeing incredible traction with manufacturing and interest around that, because the separate and distinct OT network is no longer taking place because everything's so flat. Does that help a little bit?
It does. It does. And thank you for that. It is almost like one of the last frontiers, if you will, manufacturers trying to make that jump. But thanks for your feedback. Appreciate it.
No, thank you. It was funny. My kids, for Christmas, we went and got this fancy San Francisco yuppie place. You design your own bag, and you can actually look at the cameras on the manufacturing floor and see which colors and everything else. And it was all about, that relationship and how that communicated. So it's good. So I think this is a great slide that, we can continue conversation, and definitely, raise your hands or interrupt. It's no big deal. If you pull this out, the next slide, Craig, for me would be great. I think there we go. This is really kind of where we're at, is this the onslaught of devices, and the 75 billion gets quoted by various multiple analysts and everything else. And I'm seeing an interesting situation now where at the core, our line of business, manufacturing OT devices, Internet of Medical Things, there's, Gerald mentions in banking. But then what we're now seeing is that we've got the building management tools. And then outside of that, you start seeing IoT of cameras and the Wi-Fi networks. And so really for us that, yeah, no, that next slide's perfect, Greg, is, these are the various things that by seeing everything, you can start having conversation. And if you think about 75 billion devices, and these aren't the doorbells at our personal home, this is within the enterprise, we start asking, the asset inventory, the compliance, and we're doing a compliance situation now where credit card handhelds. Think about how many times you've put your card in a credit card reader that's been in a handheld, and you can walk to an organization or retail. You're at a resort, for example, and they swipe your card. Well, those are got PCI compliance elements. How many devices are walking around? Can you communicate back to that? So we see a lot of that information. And then what we really see the bottom two, this idea of network access control and zero trust segmentation. The network is absolutely, philosophically, one of the best places to mitigate risk around IoT. Unlike a workstation driven by a human, where you can 1 minute check the football score and the next minute you're doing work, an IoT device has a very specific use and a workload of what it's supposed to be doing. So if you think about that, by definition, you can actually really get into a whitelist situation. Only allow this device to navigate the environment in its core job function. And the best easy way to explain this is if I grab Siemens, it makes sense for Siemens to communicate with the Netherlands and get an update server on Friday when they receive patches. That should be the only external call that this Siemens device is doing. We can start whitelisting the environment so it only makes that call during this time. Any other external call, we're not going to allow. And so you're really starting to get in front of this situation through using network access control or firewall or the switch to build a true zero trust segmentation, because of the fact that IoT by its very nature has a finite job task. And that gets very excited because instead of trying to respond and react to every new threat, we can start building by high value devices some very interesting things. And the only way you can start building concise, ACLs and DACLs around that environment is to understand what's really out there, and not just understand what's out there, but how it's communicating. If you flow forward 2 slides, Greg, I think there's a good visual of what I mean by actually actively communicating. So this is a Constellation View where we can logically grab a group. So we can grab physical plant devices and we put them in that circle, and then each line, and then we can start to show where they're communicating. And it's a radial situation where in the inside's inside the network and the outside's external communication. And then we can start showing specifically what this logical group is. And then to Craig's point, with one click of the button, we can see which of these logical groups are spread across the VLAN. So is my son really using that closet, or we have shoes everywhere? We get down to the subnet information. This gets very exciting for handling all the devices in the environment. So Craig, I kind of rambled there a little bit. I definitely want you to bring me back or add some commentary that I might have missed.
So first thing is, Mike, I still see your hand up. Do you have another question?
Yeah, it's another just a thought. I noticed how you quickly passed over the home issues, but think about it a minute. We've extended the trust of our corporate networks out to our employees' homes.
Yes.
And so now, how do you wrap all this in and take care of the threats that might exist in those individuals' homes that would render them useless in terms of doing anything for the corporation if they happen to be a critical employee?
Yeah, so we're talking about that live now, Mike, because you're right, because with the COVID and the way people work is so aggressively changed, we have the ability to start thinking about what should that workstation and or user be communicating with, right? And do we start to see external calls beyond that? And then ideally where I think the technology is going in general, I'm not saying ours per se, but the technology in general is, as we start using more and more kind of cloud SASE connectivity issues, do we start putting sensors in the cloud through that traffic? And you have to be careful when it comes to, IoT, Mike, is you want to be we pride ourselves on being non-disruptive and passive to the network. And so we don't want to get back to a full proxy situation, breaking down all this information, because we all remember what it did for performance and customer work use cases. So I think it's very much on the minds of people is what's behind the home. So when I log in behind the home and I've got a Nest doorbell or whatever the case may be, is that now possibly somehow leaking through? I think that is being actively looked at and talked about, and we'll see more about that, I'm sure. Good point.
And speaking of that, is what's the best way of looking at IoT? From an agent perspective, the agentless perspective. Do most of the IoT asset systems do they work with other information gathering systems like tap and ag systems and stuff? How can you take advantage? Like we're describing. The network is no longer the brick and mortar one location. The network is everywhere. How do you collect that? With asset management being like the number one and number two of every security framework there is.
Yeah, no, Craig, that's a really good point, because it's that balancing point of you want to see everything, but at the same time, you don't want to be disrupting how the network is operating and working. And because of the pervasiveness and growth of IoT devices, and due to the fact that it simply can't even handle a marker or an agent, we really believe that deep packet inspection moving across the network is the best way to capture this information, Craig. But frankly, you need to start putting sensors at various hops in the network. And one of the great things, and something that I've been really thrilled with working with Teneo on, is since you guys have been building out network infrastructure with tap sensors like Gigamon, for example, we can capture that traffic, reduce the workload of all the sensors across the network, and now really kind of grab all that information. So we really spend a lot of time working with, tap sensor technologies like a Gigamon and others out in the space, so we can use that data in a passive, non-disruptive way, grab our deep packet. We decode certain protocols, like, for medical protocols, and we've got some stuff in banking, for example. But that's a great point, and it allows for scale and, frankly, fast deployment. We constantly, if there's mirrors of traffic that are residing in a network that we can tap into, Greg, it allows us to get to our job easier. And one of the great things, and you've seen it firsthand, is, through machine learning, we start discovering things we'll start discovering everything immediately, but then through machine learning, we keep tuning and tweaking based on behavioral patterns. To take your example of that Windows 98 on a Friday afternoon, then on Monday morning when you walked in, we knew it was a Windows CE handheld device, right, on a manufacturing floor. So that's a great point. Thank you.
Yeah, and I mean, that's the nice thing about Autolearning. Can you talk a little bit about how do you take it to the next step? The first idea is we got to see it. We got to get visibility. And then, we're going to recognize what we're going to do and what they're going to do. But do you work with multiple security vendors, or how do you take it to that last step, that zero trust, and actually orchestrate a change or a modification? Do you integrate with security partners, and how do you do that? How is that?
No, that's so, I think it's crucial, because we all know we don't need to get in. We could have a whole separate call on the human capital resource crunch on people within IT. So the best way to do that is, and thank you for pulling this up, it's specific here, is this is an example. That blue trapezoid represents a behavioral learned IP flow of that particular device. And so we, Craig, start to establish baselines like I talked about of what an IoT device should do across the network. And because we know that, we can start detecting anomalous behavior. So in a react mode, we believe we want to communicate into the existing security operations center, into the SIM. How do they quarantine? If I were to call and say my laptop had a problem, how would they quarantine my laptop? how do we communicate that and do that? And we can do that in anomalous mode. Where it gets more interesting for us, Craig, is this idea of taking those blue trapezoids, which is the known good behavior, and building a micro-segmentation policy to only let the devices do those blue trapezoid unique IP flows for that device. Well, this is where it sounds really, really cool at the surface, but you have to think about it. If I just told the firewall administrator, for example, Craig, we found all these IoT devices, oh, by the way, go figure out the proper firewall access control list to allow and disallow these devices, no one has time for that in any capacity. So what we believe is not only should we integrate into the existing security and network infrastructure for enforcement, for communication, Craig, what if we actually are able to author and model the policy in the native language of the firewall, the switch, or the network access control? So it's a much different day two feel for the organization. Instead of saying, we found all these devices, you got a lot of problems, go figure it out. What we believe is to really be holistic and make microsegmentation work is, hey, we found these devices, we have authored a firewall enforcement policy in Checkpoint's native language to be ingested into the Checkpoint firewall hands-free, automated. And oh, by the way, once that policy's been created for a profile of Sony cameras, every time another Sony camera gets added anywhere in the environment, it will be automatically protected. And Craig, I always, when I have these kind of conversations, I love the idea of whitelisting stuff, but I always want to pull out, what does day two management look like? And if you can't do it in an automated way, with the growth rate of IoT, it's going to be miserable. And so we're very much focused on authoring policy and making it touchless and be ingested through APIs and frankly through real integrations at the switch, the firewall, and even the CMDB level. I can't tell you how many people have spent, significant dollars on ServiceNow or other really important tools, and they haven't thought about how to keep up with the IoT explosion. What if we were able to find all the IoT devices and communicate back to that CMDB database, which they've invested in, and incorporate and populate IoT information? We're doing that today. So I'm glad you pulled that out, because most people are just blown away that they actually know what it is. We're trying to actually now drive it forward through this process. Thank you.
Yeah, and the ultimate goal is to make a secure environment. Detection is one thing, prevention is the other, right? The ultimate goal is not to let something happen. So we went from seeing or visibility into the environment to securing it, to segmenting it, to securing it. Does anybody else have any questions while we are at a quick lull here for a second? So from the environments, do people see an issue with their IoT environment? And the reason why I wanted to bring up this screen in this conversation is a lot of times, every organization has different products that are working at, and every single product looks in a different way, right? So one of the things that this gives you is, there's story after story after story that's happened. And the one I love telling is the casino that got hacked because somebody had a fish tank that had a wireless temperature control on it. And they were able to hack into the wireless temperature control, which was then connected to a VLAN that it shouldn't have been connected to. A VLAN that it shouldn't have been connected to, and that allowed these people to get in through a wireless connection to a fish tank temperature control system directly into the system. Another one that's kind of a neat story is Target several years ago. They got hacked in through an HVAC third-party vendor, right, for the thermostat control. So the hackers, and if everybody sat on the 9 o'clock keynote speak, his theme of that story was the hackers don't sit still. They're always looking for the next thing, right? And hackers are lazy, right? They're going to try to hack the lowest common denominator. So, and a lowest common denominator is something that that is out there that hasn't been patched. So they're going to pinprick your walls until they find the not patched ones. And then once they, if you got all those covered, they're going to go a little bit deeper. It's not like they're going to stop. It's not that they're going to go to sleep. They're going to change. Gives you the ability to be able to see your entire environment. And that's the one thing I really like about this is that, the solutions that are out there now allow you to see everything that's going on in your environment, not just your laptops or your mobile phones. You may have an MDM to manage your mobile phones, and you may have a SIM that's looking at something else, but you're not seeing all of it. And it's not only just do I have mobile phones, but are they connecting to my wireless? Are they hitting the right VLANs? And one of the things that, as an example, that we just saw in this manufacturing plant from a week ago, is he had phones that are supposed to be on certain VLANs, their guest VLAN, and not on their private VLANs. And guess what showed up on their private VLANs? One of the things that was interesting to that customer in the statement, and I would love to hear if you guys have this concern too, is he says, I have ghost IPs that pop up. And what he was meaning was every once in a while he would see a device that would pop up on their network and it would disappear. And then it would pop up somewhere else on the network and it would disappear. But since he didn't have something that was actively looking and actively monitoring for it, he could never catch it in time to understand what it was. We haven't seen that ghost IP pop up yet in their environment with the POC that they've got running, proof of concept that they've got running. But that was one of our ultimate goals, was to see if we can capture that information.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Craig, because it's a known hacking technique to spoof an IP address, right? If they get access and also they can grab a port for a printer or whatever else to spoof that IP. But just by inherently, now all of a sudden the device communication changes, right? The asset device, what we see from the deep packet inspection, we now realize it's not a printer speaking to us. And it's significant, and it's a pretty common hack trick to kind of spoof that. And I think if we look at Roku and some of the things that people are talking about for ransomware, they're using SMB, protocol situations, and that's based on vulnerability information, right? One of the best things that people are talking about with Roku and ways to prevent is you've got to first understand which of your old OSs might be communicating on that protocol when they're moving laterally. And then you can also then real time with tools start to figure out this device is now communicating in such a way that does not fit how the device should talk about. It is a malicious traffic pattern of communication. Is it 100% effective? Obviously not. But boy, I tell you what, it really starts helping you move down the path of what's taking place to quarantine, isolate, and remediate potentially as well. So we've seen a lot of that. And the other thing that we've seen a lot is shadow IT. You talk about these different stories, and the fish tank story is a great one. But we frankly walk in all the time to any type of environment, and there's an Alexa plugged on the network, right? It's listening to things. Forget medical for a second. Imagine being in engineering where design and everything else and intellectual property is being recorded potentially. I'm not exaggerating. And organizations don't have a feel for shadow IoT. And that's one of the things I love about working with people like, the Teneo group is you guys are helping drive the concept of IoT discovery. Let us show you what's out there. Give us a spam port for 7 to 10 days. Let us show you specifically, let's give you more data than you've ever seen about not just IoT, but everything on your environment. And let's start having a conversation. And I love that. That's how you have to attack it. You have to understand exactly what it is. And what I always challenge customers all the time is how many unmanaged devices you have in your environment. And I never get Craig, I never get an exact answer, but that's not the real question. The next question is, how many unmanaged devices, IoT, et cetera, are you forecasting 24 months out from today, from this point in time? And they traditionally are like, I have no idea. Well, let's start thinking about that. Let's get you in a spot where you can always answer that question. This is what I have out now, and then you can actually take it somewhere really cool. We're working with clients today who recognize that this is a challenge today, and they're registering devices through like their CMDB. And so we have the ability to communicate to a CMDB and say, hey, this is a new class of device. Is this something that you want on the network? Or do you want us to kick it off, or whatever the case may be? And so now you have this relationship where you're allowing a kind of a knock, here's who they are, they're allowed in or not allowed in, or we found you, and then you build policy around it. So it's not just, it's an onboarding process, Craig, and then an enforcement policy. And you can't do any of those things. You can't pivot in any capacity if you don't see it real time on the network with precision.
Yeah. So I did have.
Go ahead.
I did have a question that came through on the chat about, how is these solutions priced? Is it priced by device? And I was going to say this from the outside looking in, as a reseller versus as the vendor, we're seeing a change in the industry on how IoT organizations are selling their solution. Historically, it was sold based on the discovery of devices. And there's sort of a true up in the end. And most of the IoT industry realizes that becomes almost a difficult way to continuously work with customers, because one customer may end up bringing on a ton of devices, and all of a sudden their bill went up. So there's a change in the market a little bit on how these solutions are being priced, and it's more on price based on the number of users that an organization has, or even make it simpler if you are in the medical field. It's the number of beds that your hospital organization will have. So that's a good news. That tells me that the IoT vendor organizations are recognizing that they have to make sure that their solution is configured the way that customers are consuming the solution. One of the ideas, and again, one of the things I wanted to talk a minute or two about, and I know we talked about it, is the VLAN profiling, which I just, hands down, love the idea of being able to have a visual perspective of how your VLANs are tied together. Eric, I know I'm going to put you on the spot, but do you have like a demo of your screen just from the VLAN side?
Actually, I thought we've talked about, I know you well enough, Craig, in terms of what excites you. So if you allow me to share, I think I can probably do that. So if you stop sharing, I can probably grab and make that happen here. 1 second here.
Another beauty about being virtual versus being on location. Just so you know, I would love to be on location, not virtual, but
I feel the same way. So can you guys all see this, I hope?
I can, yes.
Okay, so like I mentioned, this is an interesting view where I can start to, for example, grab a group of profile devices. We segment these devices. So we earlier talked here. So for example, here's industrial devices, and we've logically found all the profile of the devices. And then what's interesting here, we start to see the traffic patterns of to whom they're communicating. So here are this is showing me how the industrial devices group is communicating with the servers in the environment. And you'll see here that 11 unique profiles with each profile has a certain number of devices in it. And so this is starting to tell us something about what we are seeing across the board. Now, to your point, Craig, and so we can literally do one click and say, okay, how are they communicating to servers? And then we'll start seeing the different flow information will populate around that. And you can start seeing all the unique flows and protocols. But to your point, we have a policy, that, we only want industrial devices in a certain VLAN. So please share, validate that that's taking place. Well, sure enough, we've got 284 devices spread across 4 VLANs, not just one VLAN. And you'll see there's a preponderance of devices, 162 on VLAN 496, but we've got here 22 devices, and now we can literally go in and start to see what's taking place, what is actually out there, right, in terms of the types of devices that are on that VLAN and how are they communicating. You'll notice, by the way, Craig, that we've actually said that some of these devices we've assigned a high risk score. So now we've got a device that's not supposed to be where it's at, Craig, and it's actually doing something that we're uncomfortable with from a criticality. And so how do we then start having a conversation around that? So pretty powerful way for a quick traffic analysis on everything and see it down to the VLAN as well as the subnets even, where these 284 devices happen. And remember, this is not just IoT. This is, you can see workstations and other things in terms of how they communicate. So I really think that's an exciting part of our technology. And it really speaks to that whole, closet and shoe analogy in my mind.
So one of the neat things that we just did, if you slide just back up a little bit, Eric, and click on the, no, I'm sorry, the other way. Click on the inventory tab across the top.
Oh yeah, sure.
So one of the things I wanted to talk about, and I think it's the device inventory on the left.
Yeah, sure. Let me take the device inventory here. 1 second. I just gotta, let's go to the device inventory. Let me get rid of this query because it was kind of moved through there. And we can, here you go.
Yeah. So, when we originally started this conversation, we talked about C and then segment and then secure. So as you can see from this environment is, the ultimate goal for any IoT solution is to be able to see everything, and not just IoT devices, but everything. And, and I had mentioned this a little bit earlier, if you look at any cybersecurity framework, from the NIST framework to the CIS, former SANS framework, or the new CMMC frameworks, you're going to see that asset management is the #1 and #2. Both software asset management and hardware asset management is #1 and #2 solution. I always joke that it's like as we got into the IoT space, because our ultimate goal was we were working with some medical providers, and they needed to understand all their devices and where they were located, right? And because they just didn't know. We're supposed to have 50 IB machines, and we have 75, or we have 12. Where did they go? Are they offline? What's going on? That the asset management piece was actually a side effect of understanding how to secure your IoT environment. The segment piece is understanding that I have a industrial device that's sitting on the wrong VLAN. And then the secure piece is, now what do you do with that? Do you do it yourself? Do you take the IoT product and handle it? Or do you orchestrate that with other solutions that you have in your environment, being maybe a Gigamon to pull in multiple locations or pull in information from the cloud too? Or is, on the other end, do you have a SIM like a Rapid7 or a Splunk that you're using? Or even down to the cybersecurity access control side, or you're using Cisco or Palo Alto or Checkpoint. How do you orchestrate these things tying together? You should never have your camera talking to China, right? Because
That's
now
right.
that first thing that you're going to know is China's now got a camera sitting on your manufacturing floor watching what you're doing, right? That camera should only be going to a server that's sitting in your corporate network. If it ever goes out any other place, that should be killed immediately, and there should be a policy defined for it. So,
yeah. And for example, we took 2 clicks. We did Windows 7, like we talked about, this idea of old OSs. And some of these devices will make sense to the IT administrator that should be Windows 7. But, I spoke to this idea of the printer. We can tell you where the printer is located, what exactly it is, and let's get out there right now. Why do we want to have a printer that's still running Windows 7, for example? And it's nothing. It's frankly giving some advanced information, and you'd be surprised that for most cases, all they see is this MAC address. This is what they know this on the IP and the MAC address. They have no detail on the serial number or the window, the embedded OS, et cetera. And this is the point, Craig, you've been making this morning, which is the importance of seeing.
So